University here at Western, and I'm also a faculty member in the elementary ed department. And I don't want to spend a lot of time up here talking because I could spend the whole hour and a half just telling you how amazing Dr. Nieto and Dr. Bode are, and I've had the privilege of knowing them both very well. But I do want to say that this night tonight was 19 years in the making. 19 years, and so, woo! So I also want to make a shout out to Dr. Lauke back there, because actually it was Dr. Lauke 19 years ago that inspired this night tonight. So thank you, Dr. Lauke. And while I'm thanking people, I want to say that this night also couldn't happen without Woodring College of Education. And thank you, Mike Henniger, for being here and representing Woodring. Woodring donated quite a bit to make sure that Sonia and Patty were here, and also we have our panelists who are coming tomorrow night as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that after the presentation. So I hope you can come for both nights. Also, I'd like to thank Catherine Collier. Without Catherine Collier and the Circle Grant, this night also couldn't have happened. So thank you to Catherine Collier. And of course, Dean Salzman, who is a believer in multicultural ed. Without the leadership of Dean Salzman and Michael Henniger, we wouldn't be able to really be trying to live what we're talking about, walking the walk. And I also, I don't know if Pam Large is here right now. Is Pam here? Pam has been extraordinary in making sure this event was seamless, and she made sure that our keynote speakers were well taken care of, and she's just an extraordinary addition to our college. So thank you, Pam, wherever you are. Thank you, Pam. And of course, thank you to my staff at SEED. Yes, and past staff at SEED, because actually it took us 2 years to make this night really happen. It was 19 years in the making. It took us 2 years. And of course, we have SEED members who are here 2 years ago working hard, and it's really extraordinary. So thank you to all of my SEED staff members. Would you all stand up if you were previous or are right now SEED staff members, please? Yeah! Woo! Thank you! And in the back. Okay. Please silence your cell phones. I always want to say that. It just sounds so official. All right. So tonight, one of my colleagues who, was it Jason who coined Nieto Istas? Or was that you, Patty? Christy Clark, who is quite famous in her own right, talks about those of us who are dedicated to the work of Dr. Sonia Nieto as Nieto Istas. And I have to say that one of the Nieto Istas, Jason Irizarry, who's a professor at UConn, when he was giving a presentation once about the work of affirming diversity and working with Dr. Nieto, he likened it to me-search. So tonight I'm going to share a little me-search with you. So it was about 19 years ago that I came to Western Washington University's campus as an undergraduate. And I came as an anthropology student. And it was in Dr. Lauke's cross-cultural education class that I had the privilege of reading the first edition of Affirming Diversity. And actually, Dr. Lauke had the opportunity to see the manuscript and give feedback. So it was in '92 that I read the book, and it was the first textbook, well, it wasn't really a textbook, actually. It was the first book in a college class that I read and reread and highlighted and wrote in the margins. And it was the book that I would never sell back. And in fact, I still have my first copy of that, of the first edition. So I was in that classroom and reading this and so inspired. And when I went into the classroom in Marysville, Washington, and started teaching, I continued to use this book. And I started working with a wonderful colleague, Barb Yasui, who's also here. So, my history, it's like, this is your life, Kristen French. Barb Yasui was a fabulous colleague of mine who introduced me to REACH, which is Gary Howard's, originally Gary Howard's respecting ethnic and cultural heritage nonprofit organization, which is coming to Western in the fall in Seed. And it was through REACH and through Barb Yasui as the multicultural director that I had the opportunity to go to a conference, REACH-sponsored conference in South Padre Island, Texas, because Dr. Sonia Nieto was presenting there. So this was around 1998. So I had read the book and had been completely immersed in the work of being, in developing my multicultural personhood in the classroom. So I apologize, Sonia, for telling this story, but I have to do it because I've been dreaming of this night for about 19 years. So there I was at the conference. Sonia gave this amazing keynote, which you'll see, not the same one. But I just wanted to introduce myself and say, oh, Dr. Nieto, I'm such a fan of yours, and I really respect your work, and I've been using your book for all these years. And I got too shy. She was surrounded by so many people afterward that I just couldn't quite go up there and introduce myself. So afterwards, I just kicked myself. Why didn't I just introduce myself to my hero? And so I walked into the ladies' restroom, and there she was, washing her hands. And of course, like a perfect stalker, I go right up to her and say, Dr. Nieto, I'm your biggest fan. And I thought at that moment, when everything slows down and it gets very slow motion, that, oh my goodness, the security is going to come, they're going to haul me off, and I'm going to have to leave the conference. But instead of calling security, Sonia actually asked me to join her and the rest of the keynote speakers for lunch. So here I was, a teacher in Marysville, just so honored to be able to learn from the people that I was actually utilizing their research in my classroom. So after that, we went back to the hotel in the same car, and she said, why don't you come to UMass Amherst and study with me? And so believe it or not, this pregnant teenager, barely made it to the community college, who made it through this amazing program here at Western, got to travel 3,000 miles to University of Massachusetts to study with Sonia. And that's when I met Patty. And Patty is an incredible, I've been teasing her all day today saying she's an artist, she's a social justice artist, but she's organized. So she is just the perfect woman who I admire so much. So Patty, actually, we have a fabulous history together as well. I got to learn right alongside with Patty. She was my mentor in the doctoral program, and she was also my daughter's teacher. So I got to see the incredible work that she truly does and how she transforms children's lives. And Patty right now is the director of art education at Tufts University. So in her busy schedule, she found time to come out here with us and share her knowledge and her activism. So it's really an honor this evening, 20 years in the making, to say full circle, look what happens for those of you here who are students at Western. This could be you. Read your texts. So I would love to introduce you this evening to two of my most favorite women in the whole entire world. Please welcome Dr. Sonia Nieto and Dr. Patty Bode.
Thank you very much. Now, do you hear this mic? Do you hear it? No.
It's on.
It's on. Okay, I'll try to use my teacher voice. I should mention something. Yeah, there it goes. I should mention that what the connection is with Patty, besides the fact that I was lucky enough to have Patty as a doctoral student also, like Kristen, that just as she was finishing her doctorate, or maybe had started already at Tufts University, I had to face the 5th edition of Affirming Diversity. I had written the 4 first editions, And I knew I wanted to collaborate with someone because I wanted to keep it going, but it would be so great to do it with somebody, and I thought of Patty. And so I asked her if she would collaborate with me. We did the 5th edition, and that's the one that you've been using in your classes, those of you who've taken classes with Kristen. And we're currently working on the 6th edition, so it has taken on a life of its own. So let's see, this evening we're going to work together, and one of us will speak part of the time, the other one will speak the other part of the time, and we want to talk with you about what it means to reignite multicultural education, and Patty can begin. Right?
Sure. Okay. Pardon me, Sonia.
It's okay. So we just want to start out by remembering 3 different components of reigniting multicultural education, the first of which is remembering the roots of multicultural education. We have an image of this book here, which is putting the movement back into civil rights teaching, which is available from Teaching for Change. And it's a reminder that multicultural education started in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. It was especially launched in communities of color, especially African American communities who were really fighting for their children to have a right to equal education, and spread throughout Latino communities and Asian communities and Native communities and many underrepresented communities in the education system. And remembering the roots of the civil rights movement and the scholars and researchers such as Dr. James Banks, who you have nearby at University of Washington in Seattle, and many others, is critical to the whole frame tonight of the roots of multicultural ed.
Okay. We also want to build on the progressive legacy of multicultural education and remember that it didn't, I should use this probably, right? It didn't simply start because some people wanted to celebrate holidays and heroes. And unfortunately, that's what it's become in a lot of places. But I'll share with you in a moment some of that progressive legacy. It started with people really wanting to affect in a positive way the education of students, particularly marginalized students. And usually that meant students of color, students who lived in poverty, of all races and backgrounds, and students who were all students who were not getting the true comprehensive education that they deserved. Oh, and then also we're going to say a few words, I will say a few words about acknowledging the current socio-political context of multicultural education, because that's, keeping these 3 things in mind is what to us it means how to reignite multicultural education. So this is Mildred Dykeman, and probably, even if you're in multicultural education, not somebody who you've heard of. In the 1973 yearbook of the National Council for the Social Studies, which was edited by James Banks, I remember in 1973, it was one of the very first books that I read in multicultural education. I started studying for my doctorate in 1975, and I found this book, and it was a treasure trove. She was a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Sonoma State College, and she wrote this chapter that was incredibly incisive, called Teaching Cultural Pluralism. And to me, it sums up the most progressive tenets of multicultural education. She begins her chapter with the following statement. I am concerned here with the elimination of racial and cultural bias from the school system, but an effective attack on that problem requires an understanding of the process by which our schools became racist institutions, and the reasons why they are still characterized for the most part by a pervasive racism today. She said, American schools are racist by design. This is not a namby-pamby kind of multicultural education. This is a progressive kind of multicultural education that is at the heart of the field. She also said that schools are a massive system of public indoctrination and also the major sorting mechanism in the society. So what about the curriculum? This is what she wrote. The content of the curriculum, in cooperation with many other parts of the school system, carries out the two major functions of schools: inculcating in the majority of its pupils an acceptance of the American social system, building into them enough allegiance that they will take their places in the employed and employable lower classes as loyal and manipulable citizens, and selecting for upward mobility those few who are acceptable and needed, those, quote, outstanding exceptions, who will be pointed out as demonstrations of the validity of the school's ideology. And she concludes her argument with what must have been an incredibly radical idea in education at the time. The moral is clear, she wrote. If we are to root out racism from the schools and introduce an awareness of ethnic diversity, we must recognize that we are engaged in what is historically a subversive task. So this is not the kind of education that we often see associated with the way that multicultural education is practiced. So our message today is to build on these roots. They're really important roots. Unfortunately, Mildred Dykman, I don't believe, ever wrote anything else in multicultural education. But to me, I think this is one of the premier and most important texts or chapters in the field. So we also want to say something about the framework for promoting quality education for all students, because it means acknowledging the current socio-political context. It means understanding socio-cultural knowledge and understandings, and also personal values and commitments. And I'll tell you what we mean by this. This is sort of our theoretical frame and the foundation for understanding multicultural education. So what we want to do is share with you this theoretical frame and then have some teaching and school examples of how it can work. So, for example, the socio-political context, and at the societal level and at the school level. So we want to take a look at both of those levels. And what does that mean? Well, at the societal level, it means asking important questions such as, who has access to education and healthcare? Who has access to employment and housing? So it's not just about schools. A true multicultural educator really asks these questions that go beyond the classroom and go also beyond the school. It means what counts, whose language is standard, and who determines that, and whose lifestyle is normal, and who determines that. Patty gave a wonderful example of that before with young first graders who had normalized having two mommies or two daddies, and those kids had a very different interpretation of what is normal. They had expanded the definition of what is normal. So it means looking at these important questions at the societal level. And at the school level, it means looking at the kinds of school policies and practices that either help or hinder the learning of students, that either privilege some or put others in jeopardy. So, for example, looking at the curriculum, whose knowledge counts and who determines that? The bottom questions are who benefits and who loses. These are questions that Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, I know that those of you who are studying with Kristen know who Paulo Freire is, or was, and he always asked us to look at that question, who benefits and who loses? And he wasn't saying it in the sense that somebody always has to lose, but to challenge people to think about why some people are losing and how we can make it more equitable. So, for example, whose knowledge is respected and affirmed in the curriculum? I often give the example of myself as a Puerto Rican kid growing up in Brooklyn, New York. I never saw anything about Puerto Ricans in the curriculum. And it wasn't until I was a master's student that I had my first Puerto Rican instructor, and finally, the course was on Puerto Rican history and culture. So then is when I learned something. The message is, it's not about me. It's about, what messages are kids getting? Why do some of them feel marginalized? Why do some of them feel that they're not speaking the correct language, that they're not from the right group of people? And so it makes kids, all kids, it puts them at a disadvantage. Those who are marginalized and invisible feel that they have nothing to offer, that their people have done nothing. Those who are overprivileged feel that their people have done everything, and both lose as a result of that. And so it means looking at curriculum in a much broader frame, and not just history. I'm not talking about just history, the Great Wars, or the way that history is taught nowadays, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But it means looking at like the history of art. You know, Patty is an art educator. It means looking at the history of music. It means looking at the history of science. It means looking at all of that content area and what's presented and what isn't presented and why isn't it presented and who benefits and who loses. Okay, so sociocultural knowledge and understanding. So what do we mean by that? So we mean asking questions such as, who are the students in our schools and in our classrooms? So there's no generic student. There's no such thing as a generic student. There are only students who come to us with their cultures, their languages, their experiences, and every child comes with that. So rather than seeing students as lacking in everything, what we need to see is that all students bring something. You know, instead of thinking, oh, that poor child does not speak English. Instead asking, what does that child speak? Because almost all children come with a language to school. And how can we take advantage of it? It means, what experiences, talents, strengths, and resources do they bring to their education? I often talk about how when my younger daughter was 3 years old and I brought her to daycare, the teacher said, and we spoke only Spanish at home, and the teacher said, oh, I see she doesn't have language. Well, you know, I said, she does have language, it's just not the English language. Within 3 months, she was fluent in English and Spanish. So, you know, she was 3 years old. Kids pick up languages right away. So it's asking that question about what resources, what experiences, talents, and strengths do they bring? So, and what resources do their parents have, and what about in their communities? You know, there are some teachers who will teach in school for years and not really venture out into that community and know nothing about it. You know? Instead of finding out what are the resources there. Every community has resources to build on. So that means doing home visits, that means getting to know the corner bodega, getting to know the factory, getting to know the vendors, everybody who's in the community, and how can we use those talents and resources. Okay, and that's the same thing. So what about personal values and commitments? Now, before I go into this, I just want to say a word about that usually when we think about personal values and commitments in multicultural education, we tend to think that, you know, if only teachers changed, then everything would be okay. If teachers became anti-racist, if they did interesting curriculum, if they used great pedagogy, if they did outreach, well, I think a lot of things would change if all those things happened. But teachers are not the only ones. And so I think that we have a tendency, and that's why I put this as the third one, we have a tendency to focus only on teachers' own values and commitments, which are absolutely essential and really important, but that's not all there is. But having said that, it is important to think about, these understandings that teachers have. For example, understanding that racism and classism and other biases are all around us. That's an important thing for all teachers to know. And that means to also recognize their own privilege, because all of us, no matter who we are, no matter what our own identities are, have some kind of privilege. You know, it can be age, it can be gender, it can be race, ethnicity, language, and recognizing that. It also means examining, of course, our own commitments and values and biases. And some of these things are so hidden that we don't even realize them. That, for example, a teacher may think, unwittingly and not wanting to, that, you know, when a child speaks a language other than English, that child can't do the hard work that the other kids are doing without even trying. Or that because the child has an accent, the child is not as smart. Or, as I've heard too often, a kid of color going into an honors class and the teacher saying, "Are you sure you belong in this class?" Not mean-spirited, just having these biases that they're not even aware of sometimes. So that means then doing something about it. After we examine our biases, doing something about it. And as I said, all of us have them. So for us, quality education for all students, you know, when people say, how would you define multicultural education? Well, we have this whole definition, we have a whole chapter about it, and so on. But the bottom line to me is about access and equity. Okay? Access and equity. Who has access and how equitable is that access? You know? And I've given this example of how when my daughter went to teach at a very posh private school in New York City. She went for the interview and she had to do a lesson besides the interview. And until then, she had been directing an after-school program in the Bronx with all Latino and African American kids, all kids who lived in poverty. So she called us the night after she did the interview and, you know, telling us how it went and so on. And she said, wow, these kids, you should see. I mean, they sit around a table and there are 8 kids in a class. My kids in the Bronx would be geniuses here. And that's about the socio-political context. That's about access and equity. So, becoming a true multicultural educator, what does that mean? So we have a few things that actually we've written about in the book that we believe are important. One is that identity and difference and power and privilege are all connected. That multicultural education is not just about holidays and heroes, about having a diversity dinner. You know, those things may be nice, but they don't confront these issues of identity, difference, power, and privilege. Another important part of multicultural education is understanding that it's inclusive of many differences. While it did start out as focused on race and ethnicity because it grew out of, as Patty said, the civil rights movement, now I would say that most multicultural educators agree that it encompasses many kinds of difference, from gender and language, social class, sexual orientation, ability, religion, did I say social class, and any other differences that we can think of. Because some people are treated inequitably based on those differences, and some people have a lot of privilege based on those differences. That it's also that education, as Paulo Freire again reminded us, education is always political and that it can't be separated from the socio-political context in which it exists. We cannot see schools as an oasis from a community. They are part of a community, and they're part of our society. And that teachers are not the villains, and neither are principals, neither are superintendents. And I say this because too often, as I mentioned before, all our faith goes into what teachers can do. But teachers can't do it by themselves, and so we should recognize that. But at the same time, teachers have to have high expectations for their students, and teachers can work miracles in spite of all of the obstacles that they face. So we want to give you some examples this evening about what teachers can do based on the socio-political context, socio-cultural knowledge, and the personal values and commitments. What can teachers do? What can schools do? And what can teacher educators do? And Patty's going to give you some examples of that. So what can teachers do? And here is our framework again of the socio-political context, the sociocultural knowledge, and the personal values and commitments. So I'm going to tell you a story about the anti-mascot committee. We know that the way that history is taught in many schools is very boring for young people because it's mostly about wars and conquests and famous men. So when Marissa Mendonça Vaness, and that's her, began teaching 12 years ago, she was determined to change things. She wanted to bring history to life. She was a social studies secondary teacher. And nothing exemplifies this better than this anti-mascot curriculum that she engaged in with her students in the 2008 and 2009 school year. So let me tell you about the school that she teaches in. It's called the Springfield Renaissance Expeditionary School, and it's a school in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is not far from from the University of Massachusetts, which is my home institution. And I should mention also that, you know, I feel like I was a mentor to Marissa. She was one of the students in our program, but Patty was the one who encouraged her to come into our program in the first place, right? She was a social studies teacher at the middle school that Patty was teaching art at the time. So she is a history teacher at this highly diverse 6th to 12th grade school in Massachusetts, and it's based on direct student engagement through research and presentations concerning the core interdisciplinary curriculum. In 2008, the history teachers decided that the 8th grade curriculum should begin with a study of the pre-Columbian era, because that was an era that was really invisible in the curriculum before that. And so they chose the theme of silent voices because Native people had been really invisible in that curriculum. But rather than focus simply on the past, Marissa also wanted to bring it up to the present day. And so this happened very serendipitously one day when a student in her class happened to bring home into class an article about the use of mascots in sports teams. Since they were studying Native Americans, she decided to bring this article in. And she gave the article to her students. It was an article for college students, right? But she gave it to her students, and they got, as she said, all fired up. And they said things like, "We never learned this before," or "I can't believe we're treating them this way." And so they were outraged that an entire group of people was being used as mascots for sports teams, and they decided to do something about it. So Marissa said that ultimately the curriculum was driven by the students, not by her. The students learned about the resources in their community, the people, institutions, and places at the state and national level also. And they visited the Pequot Museum in Connecticut, and they interviewed a local member of the Seneca Nation and a board member from the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. They found out about the New England Anti-Mascot Coalition, and they interviewed its founder. And they did research in the library and on the internet, and they read an impressive array of books and articles on the topic. And they designed their own webpage and prepared a PowerPoint presentation. They were so energized that this group of students, this core group of about 15, decided that they should meet one day a week after school and on Saturdays as well to do this work. So they then prepared a document titled "A Proposal to Eliminate Native American Mascots" as the final product of the 8th grade expedition on Silence Voices. In their comprehensive proposal of 15 pages, they wrote, I think we have this slide, right? Yeah. They wrote, "Redskins, Warriors, Indians, Braves. The name changes, but the effect is the same. Using American Indians as mascots fuels stereotypical images and thoughts through American society." And their goal, it was to eliminate Native American mascots from schools in Massachusetts, especially because they found out that there was a school in their own city that used a Native American mascot. And why? They said, to remove these mascots from our school systems is an essential step in eliminating both stereotypes of Native peoples and harmful depictions and images for Native youth. So at about this time, the Springfield Republican, which is our local newspaper, printed a story about a high school in a neighboring community where they had a new superintendent, and he was offended by the use of the Native American mascot that they had in their community. And it provoked, they used the tomahawk chop, and so he wanted to put a stop to it, and so that caused a great stir in the community, as often happens. And so she decided to contact the town school committee to find out what was happening. And in turn, they contacted her, and they invited her students to speak before the school committee. So Marissa's students did a lot of preparation for this presentation, and she said it was, quote, the scariest moment that she had ever had in her teaching career. Her students had already done a presentation at a college class at the University of Massachusetts, and at their school. But they were intimidated by the fact that the school committee would be voting on the issue, and they knew that their presentation would have an impact one way or the other on their decision. So, are we going to use the video?
Sure.
So this is from the local news station who covered the story.
One of the images.
Yeah.
Do you want to show this first? Or?
No, we'll do that.
Okay.
We should take a stand on things that are wrong, and we shouldn't just be okay with people being discriminated against.
A tomahawk chop controversy in Franklin County has kids in Springfield getting involved. CBS 3 Springfield Matthew Campbell followed Renaissance school students as they made their case in Turner Falls. Here is more of tonight's top story.
Symbol of victory. These banners showcase championships from years past, and for as long as alumnus can remember, they've been the Indians of Turner's Falls High. But some are saying that name is a symbol of hate.
Does anyone honestly think that lowering America's indigenous people to the level of mascot respects and doesn't discriminate against Native Americans' culture and race?
One by one, Marissa Vanessa's 8th grade social studies class made their case for all teams, high school to pro, to drop their Native American nicknames.
And hard to understand that people could be so stereotypical and so unjust and not understand it. So I really wanted to help to send a message out.
Just picture my ethnicity group, like, to be a mascot. Like, most professionals wouldn't like that.
But this 8th grade class wasn't from Turner's, not even from Franklin County. Try Springfield's Renaissance School. They picked up on the Turner's tomahawk chop controversy, a common game day site that's been suspended by the school. The chop's future is in the hands of the school committee, and now that other students are on board, they're hoping it might sway TF students.
When students are talking to students, it gets across to the students in a way that's different from adults talking to the students.
42 schools in the state have Native American nicknames, and in the coming days, all will hear from this group. Now back at Turner, school committee members tell us the decision on the tomahawk chop is expected to be made before May 11th. As for the school's nickname, that hasn't been taken up yet, but they do tell us the presentation tonight got them thinking. Live in the newsroom, Matthew Campbell, CBS Springfield.
Okay, while Patty gets us back to the PowerPoint, let me just share with you that a month after their presentation, the school committee voted against using the tomahawk chop in their school. So the students, yay, you can clap, you can clap. And I should also mention that that young woman, Maya McCann, was Kristen's student when Kristen was a teacher in the Springfield Public Schools. So, you know, are we surprised? No. So the students decided to continue their research throughout their high school careers, they said, forming an after-school club. And they developed what Marissa describes as amazing skills in forming opinions, in debate, in doing presentations, and in writing. They've also become more sensitive to other issues and more open to finding out about other injustices. As for Marissa, this experience also changed her as a teacher. She said, I wasn't sure I could do this kind of work. It made me realize that you can do things you thought you couldn't do with a certain age group. And it changed the students and also the people who they address, because she said, when you have 13 or 14-year-olds talking about oppression, you know, and discrimination, and talking about issues that they never gave thought to, it stops people in their tracks. Marissa Vaness didn't set out to be an activist teacher. When I interviewed her, that's what she said. I didn't start out to do this, you know. But she wanted to help her students think differently about history and to help them develop a different level of awareness and to open the minds up to new and different perspectives. So she concluded, I think I believe in the power of kids even more than I did before. Now what's next? Well, as I said, the students want to keep doing this. They discovered that there are 42 schools in the state that have mascots, Native American symbols also. And so they want to go directly to the state level and ask the government and the Massachusetts Department of Education to sign a resolution calling for an end to Native American mascots, a resolution that other states have adopted. This will make the fight a little bit larger, according to Marissa, but she concluded, I've got 4 years with these kids. They have 4 years of high school ahead of them, and they are not slowing down, and I'm not slowing down either. So that's the Marissa Vaness story. That's what teachers can do, and Patty will continue.
Thank you. So we started the question about what can teachers do, coupled side by side with what can schools do, because Sonia and I have talked together and with others about how teachers cannot do this kind of work alone, nor should they. And while individual teachers can really make a difference in schools, we made note throughout our work and our research of the role of schools and school culture, courageous, innovative leaders and administrators and community members who support teachers in this work. So notice the role of the school culture throughout these pieces. So I'm going to move into what can teachers do, what can teacher educators do. And so here's our framework again for promoting quality education for all students. The socio-political context of schools, socio-cultural knowledge and understandings, and personal values. So we keep coming back to these three anchors as we move through these stories tonight. So this story that I'm going to tell you is within what we're calling post-race classrooms. And just as a reminder from the American Anthropological Association, of course, has told us that race no longer exists, which I think most of us understand the theoretical framework that statement is made within and embrace it. However, racism is alive and well. So that's the backdrop for the couple of stories that I'm going to share with you now. And these stories are also undergirded in our understandings and definitions of social justice, which we articulate in the book, and Sonia has extrapolated on quite a bit. Because social justice is a phrase we hear related to multicultural education quite a bit, and it's a term that's kind of bandied about like a volleyball, about people like to be social justice educators, and people like to be social justice senators and congresspeople on the floor of the House right now. And so it's important to talk about what that really means. So very briefly, just overview, we have four main points. That social justice needs to challenge and confront inequities and misconceptions and untruths. So it's not sitting on the sidelines. There's this active work like we saw in Marissa, providing all students with resources, not only material and economical resources, but also emotional and supportive resources to become more fully human, again, rooted in the work of Paulo Freire. And to draw on students' resources, like we heard Sonia speaking about earlier, and their funds of knowledge, as Gonzalez and Moll have asserted, and creating learning environments that promote critical thinking and agency for social change. So we saw all four of those woven together in Marissa's work, and I hope you'll see that in the story I'm about to tell you. So I'm revisiting actually a teachable moment from my teaching career in the public schools. I am at Tufts University now, but for 16 years I was in public schools. And this is revisiting a story that I first wrote about in 1999, the first edition of this book, which is Sonia's book, The Light in Their Eyes, which just came out in the 10th anniversary edition. And you can also find it for free online at Rethinking Schools. So it's called A Letter from Kaylee. And this letter from Kaylee, I was at the time an art teacher in an elementary school with a K through 6th grade population, and I entered my classroom one day and I had a message box for kids to leave me messages, because art teachers always teach hundreds and hundreds of kids. This was a school of 563 kids. I remember the number that year. And I taught every one of them. And so we had to find ways, our teachers have to find ways to communicate with all the kids and have built relationships. So the message box is an important place. And also you have to remember, though, that we teach the kids for 7 years, unlike other teachers in the school. So this message was in my message box. Dear Ms. Bode, please help. My mom was speaking to me about white people leaving brown and black people out of books. Love, Kaylee. So I sent Kaylee a message back and I said, I'm glad you asked for help. This is a problem that we need to help each other with. We need to ask our friends and teachers and families for help so we can work together. I think we should work on this problem in art class. And so what Kaylee explained to me was that she was reading a book called My Body. So this wasn't a storybook about one family. And it wasn't a storybook about one school or one community. It was a book about the human body, appropriate for first graders. And she noticed when she was reading the book with her mom that there were about 4 images of people of color in the entire book. It was a pretty big book, except one page which was about people of the world. But the rest of the book was filled with white people, as Kaylee said. So we talked about that, and we found a lot of pictures in magazines of lots of different colors of people and kinds of people, and decided to try to learn about skin color. We did a whole color theory lesson and worked together with her first grade peers to talk about the problem. Is this a problem or not? And the first graders came up with lots of critical understandings. They said, it's not a problem if the book is about one family, even though there's lots of families with lots of different colored people in it. But it is a problem when the book is called My Body or The Human Race or things like that. So they differentiated. They enlisted the help of the librarian to look at lots of other books and to find books they thought were strong representations. And then they decided that they needed to do something about it and that they would paint images of lots of different kinds of people and send those images to this publisher to let them know what they thought would be a more fair representation in the book. And the classroom teachers, some brilliant, wonderful classroom teachers, Gina Sin and Susie Secco, who we also write about in our book, Affirming Diversity, in a different case study, worked with the students. And so Nick A. said, dear publisher, could you put lots of white and black people? Thank you, Nick A. And Caroline said, dear publisher, please equalize African American, Asian, Chinese, Japanese, European, American, Puerto Rican. Sincerely, Caroline. And Scott said, dear publisher, don't leave dark skin out of books because it's not fair! Exclamation, exclamation. Point. From Scott. And then we have Erica, who went right to the boycott. Dear publisher, make your books fair, and if you don't, me and my family will never buy or read your unfair books. We want fairness. From Erica. And we did add to our vocabulary list the word boycott, and we found it in other places in history and in our communities. So, darling as these stories are, these are first graders making critical judgments and critical evaluations, and having courageous conversations. And another courageous student came forward to me. His name was Joey, and Joey said, Ms. Bode, you left out the white people. And Joey was referring to the bulletin board where we had put all the different photographs that we found in magazines of lots of different kids. And I was taken aback by Joey, and I said, Joey, what makes you say that? He said, well, because you left them out. And I said, okay, here's your clipboard. You go make a graph and use your math skills that we've learned about in this project, along with your classroom teachers, and you let me know how many white people there are and how many other people there are. And he came back and he said, there were some white people, I think, but he learned a couple of things. And he said, it's hard to tell what race people are by looking at them without talking to them. It's hard to tell if people are the quote same as you. And then he said, the reason I thought you left out the white people, even though I found white people on the bulletin board in the same numbers that I think, is because I'm used to seeing more of them. And I said, oh yeah, that's called dominant group membership. And that's something we learned about. We added it to our vocabulary list. I always say, if they can say macaroni and cheese, they can say things like socio-political context and dominant group membership, and they can understand it. So we sent off our portraits and paintings to the publisher with letters and learned how to, by the way, edit our inventive spelling into accurate spelling, because of course we want high academic achievement for all students. And then Kaylee wasn't done. She went home and analyzed her video collection. So we're not going to get into this, but diversity, here's her graph, which she had learned in math class, could be better. And here's her good and could be better, and we can agree or disagree with her analysis, but this went on for a while. So these are first graders being actively involved in their own resources, their own thinking, their own communities, their own lives. So this was an exciting time for me. Fast forward 10 years, and I found myself at Tufts University with the School of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston teaching pre-service art teachers. And these three students, Brittany Holton, Charlotte Huffman, and Elise Robbins, were all teaching at this school. Tufts is in Boston, Massachusetts, and they were teaching at the Boston Renaissance School, which is a wonderful classroom environment for all the kids there. And they came to me one day and said, the kids keep asking us the same question over and over. Ms., why are your eyes blue? And I said, oh, we're having our seminar on student teaching. What do you think makes them say that? I don't know. What did you say? I don't know. I just said, because my mom's eyes are blue. Now, I'm Sonia Nieto's student. We've read Affirming Diversity. We've done all kinds of work on anti-racism work and anti-oppression work. And I said, you said just your mom, but I didn't say that. I said, okay. We have some work to do here. I think we can interpret this as what Michael Pollock calls race talk. This is race talk. We could say, just because my mom's eyes are blue and move on, or we can embrace this as race talk. What happens, and with Brittany and Charlotte and Elise's permission, we centered our seminar around it that night. And then Charlotte, these are Charlotte's students, Charlotte designed her whole curriculum around the race talk. She studied Romero Bearden and his collage work, and here's the Boston Renaissance first grade collage. You see, I brought up the first grade examples because people think this work is always with high school social studies. And I really wanted to integrate these first grade voices. So Charlotte did a very elaborate curriculum lesson plan following Wiggins and McTighe and all the work we do with curriculum theory. And in that process of the first grade work, comparing Romero Bearden's work, she and the first graders unpacked facial features and race talk and deconstructed visual value of phenotype. And those were her enduring understandings on the first grade bulletin board. We're going to talk about the word phenotype, we're going to talk about visual value and visual culture, and where we get messages about lips and hair and shapes of eyelids and noses and nostrils. It was an exciting place to be, Ms. Charlotte's first grade art room, and studying the life of Romero Bearden and displaying this mural at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. So this is the kind of work that was starting to happen in my work with pre-service teachers. I kept reaching back into my experiences and also listening to their experiences and listening to Sonia's voice in my head. And then, an example from a high school art room. Another one of my alumni, he had just gone off to teach after being through, my program is one of these 12-month MAT programs, really intense, compressed teacher licensure master's programs, like anything inside a student cycle for 12 months. And this is RJ, one of my students who was from Wyoming and went back to the high school from which he had graduated when he was a high school student and was eager to go back to his community and serve his community and be an art teacher there, and was lucky enough to land a job. And he worked really hard, and he's a really ambitious student, and I asked RJ if I could share this with you, and he agreed. I'm going to tell you, not the pre-service teacher I would have picked to engage in race talk. Wasn't the one I would have said, he's going to go out there and do the work and walk the walk. He's a good student, not the one I thought. But here's what started to happen. Started to get emails from RJ every day sometimes, like this. I came to my former high school, hoping to change the same old small town way of life. I noticed right away there was stereotyping and generalizations made about minorities. Race is an issue, but nobody's talking about it. Every day, I mean, RJ was in it now, and he's now unpacking it. So he says, I was waiting for a good idea to come along, and meeting David Wilson, the video, was essentially an answer to my prayers. A framework on which to discuss, respond, and rebuild. And he created curriculum for high school students around this video, which, as you can see the directors here, Mosley and Wilson. This is a journalist, David Wilson here, who went and was researching his background and uncovered his relationship with the descendant of his family's, his enslaved family's history with the slave master's descendants' history. And it's a very powerful story. So he used this as a centerpiece for high school art class. It was a little bit different than the paintings of the still lifes that high school curriculum had seen. Here are some of their examples of their work. So what happened to me, and here's some examples from his lesson plan and questions he asked his student. What happened to me as a teacher educator, somebody who called myself an engaged, hopeful, developing multicultural educator was, I have to do more here because my students are struggling and my alumni are struggling. And what more can I do? Which is a constant question. What can I do to do this? Preparing teachers to talk about race and teach across lines of difference. And right then, Micah Pollock released this book. And so I knew that my student teachers could not read another thing. They were so busy in their full-time student teaching and had a course with me, the seminar, which was pretty demanding, and another course while they're full-time student teaching, a curriculum course. So I did a couple of things. I bought 12 copies of this book so they could pass them around. And this book is a great resource because Michael Pollock designed it with little tiny readings. There are these 3-page, Sonia has a piece in there. There's a lot of great scholars. There's like 60 different scholars in there who each have these 2 or 3-page pieces. So they could work in small groups, like 4 and 5 at a time, and just read this small section and present that to class. And I've been doing it for 2 years now. I just finished my 2nd year of engaging in it in this way. And I also drew from this resource. This is the resource you're talking about, which is a great resource for teacher educators and others also who want to lead courageous conversations, as Singleton and Linton call them. And they give us a framework of 4 points to keep in mind. Stay engaged. If your student teacher says, they ask me, why are your eyes blue? Stay engaged with that question. Experience discomfort. We might not know the answer. As teachers, first-grade teachers or teacher educators in a college classroom, speak your truth. I'm uncomfortable with leaving it at my mom's eyes are blue, and that's why. I'm uncomfortable with leaving Kaylee's letter unaddressed. And expect and accept non-closure. Doesn't always end tidily, doesn't always end not always the way we want. So in this work, I'm just going to give you quick examples of one small group of students. They each presented to the class, each of these small groups. So these are a few slides that I'm going to zip through. But this is an example of college student pre-service teacher work teaching their colleagues about the Everyday Anti-Racism book in a section. They were studying the section called Engaging Communities for Real. And they gave us examples from each of the scholars' writing in that section. And you can see up here the titles of each scholar's work. And you can see how they're cited. These are my students' PowerPoint slides. So they cited their work at the bottom and led us in conversations and active work around it and drew from their own students' experiences in their K through 12 classrooms while they were student teaching to try to get at some of these difficult conversations. And then they also led us in an activity at the end. We are art teachers, so we like to move around and do work. And we studied community murals. They went out into the community in Boston and drew upon those murals to engage their students and ended up doing a lot of projects in the schools based on this. And those are some other examples. And then they asked us questions and we were engaged. So that's an example of the teacher-educator sort of problem solving from the first grade teacher problem solving, trying to bring it full circle. So final thoughts. about promoting quality education for all students. If we come back to our anchor of these 3 points and these 3 assertions, the socio-political context of schools and society, if we think about, as teacher educators, drawing more upon the knowledge and the questions in the K-12 classroom, I think our work will be more authentic in this way. So often as teacher educators, it's really tempting to give to, put out to, look down to, and provide to K-12 schools without drawing upon K-12 schools and without making that circulatory system really oxygenated of what's happening with K-12 students and K-12 teachers to inform us in the teacher education classroom. The sociocultural knowledge and understandings, questioning again what counts as knowledge. Is what's counting as knowledge in the teacher educator classroom counting as knowledge in the K-12 classroom, and where is the connection and disconnect with that? And of course our own personal values and commitments, we have to walk the walk. There's a lot that gets said in teacher education classrooms, and we need to ask ourselves about how we are really supporting our students, our pre-service teachers, as well as the practicing teachers who are well-seasoned teachers in the schools, how we can be part of that community. So those are some of the final thoughts about our anchors.
And I just want to finish with, with some thoughts from Paulo Freire, actually. Because I think that when we reignite, what does it mean to reignite? It really means to rethink and redo and re-strategize, and it also means to sort of revolutionize not only our practice, but also our society, to look at it and to ask, what are our schools for? Who are our schools for? And to remember what Paulo Freire wrote, experiments cannot be transplanted. Even the experiments of multicultural education, they must be reinvented. Thank you all very much, and we're happy to take questions too.
So we left plenty of time for questions and conversation.
Yes.
Sonia talked about quality education for all students and how we can have access and equity. My question is, how do you define equity and how do you get there?
Okay, that's a whole course, but I'll try to answer. Thank you for the question. It's a really good question because I think that often we talk about equality, but we can't talk about equality because people are coming that, we don't have a level playing field. And because we don't have a level playing field, if we provide all students with the same thing, we're assuming that there is a level playing field. So for example, a great example of this is the Lao case. Those of you in bilingual education or education of English language learners know about this case. In this case, the San Francisco School District said that they were providing all their students with an equal education because they gave all students the same teachers, the same materials, the same lessons, and so on. And they were being sued by the Chinese American community because the Chinese American community said that was not equitable. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, we haven't seen that for a while, in a unanimous decision in 1972, agreed with the families that it makes a mockery of equal education when students are starting at different places. You have to be equitable. So equitable means providing resources and materials and so on that will get all students to the same place. So you can't just say, okay, all the students will study Shakespeare when they haven't had the foundation for that. But that doesn't mean that they're not able to study Shakespeare. That doesn't mean that they can't read novels by Toni Morrison. It doesn't mean that they can't do rigorous science, for example. All we have to do is think of the example of Jaime Escalante, who died a couple of weeks ago, actually. He was the teacher from East LA who was in the movie. You probably remember the movie. Some of you probably may not, but Stand and Deliver. How
How many of you saw that movie? Okay, that's a very popular movie, and if you think back to the message of that movie, well, there were several messages. One is that, for those of you who don't remember the movie or haven't seen it, to recap, was a teacher in a poverty-stricken community in East Los Angeles who insisted that his students had the right to study calculus and even to take AP calculus. And of course, they thought he was insane because they said, why would the kids in this school want to study AP calculus and they can't do it and so on. And he insisted that they could. So he had very high hopes. But he made sure that they came in on Saturdays, that they had extra work. That's what equity is about, to provide the resources, the support, and the belief, which is really important, the belief that they can do it. They took the AP test, and they did so well that the Educational Testing Service accused them of cheating. So then they said, let's go back.
They had to retake?
They had to retake it. When they retook it, they did even better the second time. And the other thing that he did was to build on their culture. Most of the students were Mexican-American students, and he said things like, come on, folks, you have to do well in this. Your people invented the zero. So that's building on their culture. And P.S., a lot of those young people who never dreamed about going to college ended up going to college, some of them, quite a number of them, to Ivy League colleges. He opened the world to them. That's what I mean by an equitable education. And how do we get there? We have teachers like you who will go out and change things, and who will question, and who will start, really having those courageous conversations that Patty referred to, in your teacher's room, in your professional development circles, with your colleagues, in your reading room, so that people start rethinking, re-energizing, reigniting what they're doing, to really make it equitable and fair, at least fair, make it fair for all students.
I want to say one thing, which is, to recap, equality is giving everybody the same thing, and equity is giving everybody what they need.
More questions?
It's kind of a subtle thing, but I'd like to hear how you expand on it. Sonia, you said equity is important, and to try and get our kids to the same place. Are they ever at the same place? Should we, as teachers or teacher educators, ever assume that anyone is at the same place as anyone else? Is there a point here where we can keep working for equity?
Yeah, well, I'll answer it, and then I'll let Patty say a few words. No, I think that we understand that all people, not just all kids, are at different places. We have to understand that. But, when we think about the tremendous privileges that some students have and the tremendous inequities that some students suffer from, then our goal is to provide the help and the support to move the kids who are most marginalized to the point where they can really be successful. That doesn't mean exactly the same thing. Some of them may surpass the other kids who have great privilege, and some of them may not. Some of them may go to college, some of them may not. But I think it's our responsibility as teachers to work as if all of them were going to college. Because if they don't have, if they don't have that option, that's our fault. If they choose not to take it, that's their decision. But it's our responsibility to make sure that we do everything for them to get there.
Okay, that's good. Let's do another one.
Okay, go on.
So I am a huge proponent of multicultural education and diversity, and I taught in New York City, and then I taught in rural Alaska. And I really, through those experiences, I felt frustrated because I felt like my teacher education program set it up to where I believed that if I felt a certain way and had a certain understanding and tried these certain
It's a wonderful question and kind of the enduring, constant question for all of us. No matter how hard we believe, there's a lot of human frailty out there. And there's a lot of imperfection in our school structures, in our leaders, and in our social structures. That's why the socio-political context is so important. And Richard Rothstein also talks a great deal about we need to look at everything. We need to look at issues of hunger and issues of medical access and issues of employment and everything for our families while we are simultaneously trying to offer the opportunity to engage in algebraic thinking and calculus at high levels for all students. So it's a complicated thing. So one thing is that there's only so much we can change at a time in our classrooms, but it's also important to not just close our classroom door and say this is the world I'm going to change right here, but at the same time look at policies and practices and how they're related and how we can engage in those, whether it's through our teachers union or through parent and community organizations, and to be a teacher leader who is supportive in community action at the same time that we are active in really keeping these high academic rigorous standards. It's also really critical to develop critical friends, that we cannot do it alone, nor should we ever. The one thing we were actually talking about Jaime Escalante a little earlier tonight, and the movie is great, and his work is fabulous, but the movie is Hollywood, so it really Hollywoodizes he as the lone, heroic teacher against the world, and that's really a disservice to all of us, because nobody can do it alone. And we really have to figure out who it is. I mean, I was in a school once in Cleveland where I was working, and I figured out that one of the most powerful people in the school to help me do what I wanted to do was the custodian. Because I wanted to hang kids' artwork everywhere all the time, and everybody kept telling me I couldn't. And once I got him on board, I was able to get the principal on board. And then other teachers saw what I was doing, and then I could help with after-school programs. And there are a lot of people in power in different ways in schools, and we need to figure out the avenues to get to them, and we need to have critical friends. You need to find one teacher to start with, who you know you can talk to every day if you have to, and then others in the school, and then kind of spread the energy and the word from there. And those are my bits of advice.
I want to answer the question a little bit differently by talking about some research that I did with teachers in the Boston Public Schools, and it resulted in a book called What Keeps Teachers Going, because I think that's also part of your question. You know, how do you keep going in spite of, and in fact, our book was called the What Keeps Teachers Going in Spite of Everything Inquiry Group. So you know what teachers were thinking about. In fact, that's the name that I wanted to give the book, but the publisher, said no, it was too long. But the teacher said that in spite of everything, peace was so important to them. And I worked with mostly, with 8 teachers, mostly veterans. So most have been teaching 15, 20, 25, 35 years. And so we worked together for a year in this inquiry group. And each chapter in the book is a response to that question, what keeps teachers going. So this is the advice that I would give, to think about what they found, or what we found together in our work. One is autobiography. Autobiography. That is, why are we going into teaching in the first place? What helps you stay there? And often we found that it was the teacher's autobiography, their race or ethnicity or their experiences, their sociocultural background, their something about their autobiography that brought them to the classroom. And they have to honor that, and they have to know it. One of the teachers I worked with, Stephen Gordon, I worked with the other day, actually a month ago or so, in Maine. I was a visiting professor there for a week, and we invited him to come up and work with us. He has since retired. He taught for 35 years. But one of the things that I did with the group was to ask them to write their teaching autobiography. And he said, at this meeting in Maine, he said, Sonia, I have been teaching 32 years at that point, but until you asked us to do that, nobody had ever asked me to think about why, I taught. And so I think that's something that all of you should doing if you're going to become teachers or if you are teachers. So that was one thing. Another one was, of course, the love of the students. I know love is not a word that we throw around too much when we talk about education nowadays. We talk about templates and rubrics and AYP and no child left behind and highly qualified teachers and all of this, all of this rhetoric, and we don't talk about love. And yet people go into it because of love of students, love of the profession, love of the content that they're teaching. Another one was hope and possibility, and they talked about, having hope in education. As, somebody asked me before when we were meeting, so what do you think of education? I said, wow, what a little question, huh? And I said, and he said, what is the future of education? And I said, education is the only way. It's the only way. That doesn't mean schooling is always good. But education is the only way. And this is the kind of sentiment that the teachers have. They really believe in public education. They believe that they could make a difference. On the other side of the coin, another thing that kept them going was desperation and anger. And, and I saw it sort of as the other side of the coin of hope and possibility. Because they talked about how angry they were. But these teachers who were fabulous teachers did not talk about being angry at kids, or they didn't make racist comments about the kids, and they didn't, talk badly about their parents. They were angry at the injustices that the students had to bear. They were angry at the structural issues that made their school so unfair. They were angry at not being treated with respect as professionals. Those are the things that they were angry at. But as one of the teachers said, but when I walk into my room, I put that anger outside. When I walk in, which the kids will have to do. Another thing that kept them going was their intellectual lives. That is that they really define themselves as intellectuals. And again, that's something that's missing in a lot of our work. Teachers are treated as automatons, as test givers and test planners and teach kids how to take tests, and that becomes it. They're given a curriculum that is called teacher-proof because, even a dummy can do it. Rather than being seen as intellectuals who have earned the right to see themselves as intellectuals. I remember Patty years ago said to me, teaching is always about research. And when you see her teaching, she's always doing research to try to get, whether she's teaching first graders or college students, because it's about researching what are good practices out there, what is the history of this particular art form, how can I make that multicultural? And so it's always about intellectual work. So that kept them going. And so these teachers, for example, were in inquiry groups, they were in study groups, they joined professional organizations, and so on and so forth. They did workshops, they mentored, that kept them going. Another thing was the ability to change the life of their students. Because they knew that they had that power. And so it's sort of, and one of the teachers said, what power? It's really scary when you think about it. That any little thing that they say could either change a student's life for good or for bad. All they had to say was, in fact, one of the teachers was asked in her own project, they had to do their own research in her inquiry group, and one of the teachers decided to send surveys to students and former students about what teachers did or said that would, that either helped them or hindered them in their learning. So what did they remember that made them feel bad? And some of these kids were in college or out in the workforce already, and they said things like, when I was in fourth grade, the teacher said I was so dumb that she put me back in kindergarten. And that student remembered it because it had been so painful. Another one wrote, too painful to talk about. And too painful to talk about. And, calling them stupid, saying you're going to end up pregnant, you're going to end up in jail, things like that. What were the things that made them feel good about themselves? A teacher saying, you did a good job. Imagine that that's all it would take. You did a good job. Or a teacher mutual friend who's really a very good friend of Patty's, whose name is B.Z. Ryder. She's an art teacher, and she took a class with me, 20 years ago at least. She's the one who said to me one day, "You have to meet this woman. She has to come and study with me." That's how we met. But anyway, B.Z. is a wonderful art teacher, and she told me that one day she was in her art room, and she always plays music while she's preparing for her students to come in. And a kid walked in to go through her room to another room, and she was playing salsa music. And he just stopped dead in his tracks. He was Puerto Rican. And he said, "Do you listen to that music too?" And, she said, "Yeah, I really like this music." That made a big impact on him. Or Patty has an example of, what's his name? Who said to you, "Bode, how come you're white and you like Puerto Rican art?"
It was Alejandro.
Alejandro. Yeah. So, it means expanding our own horizons, and that's hard work. One thing that teacher educators can't do is to give them courses that will teach their prospective teachers to learn everything there is to know about every community. That's impossible. That is impossible. Especially if you live and work in a very diverse community, but even if you don't, there's no way that I could teach all my students who are going to teach in Springfield, for example, everything that there is to know about the African American community, or about the Puerto Rican community, about the Somali community. Those are the students who they'll teach. There's no way. But I can create an environment where they want to learn about that, where they decide that this is important for me to know. I have to know how I can relate to this community. So it doesn't mean learning a list of traits, and I have a real problem with people saying, "Okay, this is how Vietnamese culture is, and this is how African American culture is," because you know what? It's never true. You may find some seeds of truth in that, and I say, "Okay, learn that and then throw it out," because it'll teach you a little bit, but you'll just fall into stereotypes if you do that. What you need to do is learn about the students in your classroom and learn about their history. So, for example, I'll use the example of Puerto Rico, the one that I'm most familiar with, because I used to teach a course called Teaching About the Puerto Rican Experience, and I found that so many teachers who were teaching most of Puerto Rican students had no idea about the history of Puerto Rico, even though the history of Puerto Rico is tied into the history of the United States, and yet they were teaching these students. And the same thing I could say about any group, about Mexican American students. How could you teach Mexican American students and not know the history of the Southwest and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? How could you not know that and not know that 2/3 of the Southwest was Mexico? How could you not know that? That's important to know. It's important to know about every single group. But the way you learn that is not through a series of traits, but through a study of history. And that means that teachers need to see their work as never ending and as always being a lifelong learner. So that's what I think is really, really important. We can't teach them everything there is to know. We can teach them how to be learners. And I'll give one more example before I turn it over to Patty. A teacher who we both know, Sharon Edwards, who was my daughter's first grade teacher, and who was becoming a multicultural teacher. I had her come into my classroom once to talk to my undergraduate students of what it means to be a multicultural educator. And she said, "Well, I wouldn't define this stuff that way yet, but I am learning." And so she brought in a lot of different things. And she said, teachers have to be scavengers. They have to always be learning, and they have to be looking everywhere for material. So, for example, she brought in a big picture book that's like a coffee table book of Paul Robeson. And she said to everybody assembled there, and most of my students were white, and she said, "How many of you know who this is?" Not one person knew who Paul Robeson was. And she said, "You see, now what I've learned," she found it at a tag sale for this book. And she said, "This man is one of the most important people in U.S. history in the 20th century. And if you don't know that, you need to learn." So I would say the same thing to all of you. If you don't know who Paul Robeson is, go learn. And that then can become part of your curriculum, right? That's how you learn. It's not by a teacher standing up and saying, "And Paul Robeson was this or Paul Robeson was that."
critical reflection of oneself, especially myself being Irish American, a person who most of the world would name as white, and because 89% of all of our teachers in the United States are middle-class white people, or on their way to being middle class if they came from working class, like I did. And because, unfortunately, still in teacher education today, the statistics are exactly the same in the pipeline. So, also, again, part of autobiography is looking at one's own privilege, no matter what race, ethnicity, language, ability, disability, sexual orientation, religion, to know that our society is fraught and wrought with privileges and access to privileges that we all engage in. And learning that early and often in teacher education, and thinking about then what it means to be empathetic to that to our students when we're trying to create equitable access to knowledge and knowledge cultivation. So what does that mean? So another example that we have in the book Affirming Diversity in Chapter 10 is about a unit about the study of Cambodia and the Cambodian-American experience, where 5 teachers got together and said, we've got 100 7th graders, 8 of them are Cambodian, not a lot, no need, right? Most people say no need to do a unit on Cambodia, 8 kids. What they noticed is the kids who identified as Cambodia and Cambodian American was that they shared a lot of things, and one of which was failing miserably academically in every subject, all of them. Now, they noticed other things about their students that were positive. They said, something's going on here. So the next thing they asked themselves was, what do I know about the Cambodian and Cambodian American experience? And they kind of looked around the table at each other and said, not much. What can we do? Well, they started out reading Lone Ong's book, First They Killed My Father, which I recommend all of you to read. And then they found a mini course workshop about Cambodia that they went together. And then they did another book group together. This was all without the support of administration and grants. And then they launched a year-long with a 6-week intensive study that all 100 of their 7th graders engaged in. And they all learned lots from it. It's all in the books, you can go read it. So that's one thing. The other thing, I point back to RJ. Remember RJ? Meeting David Wilson? RJ, my middle class white guy in the class who was resistant to courageous conversations. I'm saying, why do we have to talk about this? This isn't about teaching art. I want to teach kids how to paint. I want to teach kids how to paint still lifes. Why are we talking about this again? Race again? Class again? Inequity again? Again, Patty? Again? And then he started emailing me, and I said, you're emailing me again? His first year teaching. And when I said to him, RJ, what makes you, what's making you ask these questions? He said, duh, it was your class. Yeah. So knowing that it may not always bubble up, it's just like with first graders and 7th graders. I always say they're like a star, It gets lit light years away, and you see the light a long time later. That's what happens in teacher education. We see the light later, but we have to keep doing that work of knowing that, RJ is, I think, a great example of becoming a multicultural teacher.
Somebody here, yeah.
What are your thoughts? I'm an anthropologist, okay, and what are your thoughts with the Arizona ban and ethnic studies and the backlash? I have to ask, and by all means, teachers, big basis, school boards, and secondarily, the Texas School Board initiative on textbooks cut out a lot of ethnic, whatever.
Texas has cut out Cesar Chavez from the curriculum and has added as a hero Phyllis Schlafly, who was the anti-feminist, for those who don't know. So, I don't know what planet they're on, but, and Arizona, for those, I'm sure everybody knows what's happening in Arizona, and that ethnic studies programs at the high schools are being eliminated. But, I've heard very interesting, I had an interesting question somewhere else where I spoke recently, I don't remember, but somebody said, now what I've heard what's happening in Arizona is that they have this ethnic studies program in Tucson, it's the only one of its kind in the nation. education, I believe, and I've spoken at a conference that they have there, a wonderful conference called Transformative Education.